Today I'm talking about one of my favorite viral trends, the TikTok mental illness boom. Over the past few years, we've seen social media posts about mental illness become increasingly popular. Years ago, these posts would mainly revolve around depression, ADHD, or anxiety, diagnoses that were not unfamiliar to the public at large. But recently, trending posts have focused on far rarer disorders, like OCD, Tourette's, and even dissociative identity disorder, or DID. The submissions are typically framed as selfless acts to help others, by raising awareness or destigmatizing the condition. This recently has piqued my interest because of the increasing number of those who are self-diagnosing, particularly with DID, which was formerly multiple personality disorder, and that was already a contentious topic in psychology. Psych isn't my area of study though. I'm not here to debate what belongs in the DSM or decide who's faking or not. It's just so fascinating to me to see teenagers using mental illness as a way of self-expression. So I did a little research, and I want to talk about it. This topic is surprisingly divisive. When looking up articles on the social media mental illness explosion, you're likely to find only two stances on the issue. The line has been drawn between those who view this trend as insulting and damaging, and those who see the benefits of this trend outweighing the negatives. I'll lay out both arguments for you now so you can pick a side. Those who are outraged are quite simply arguing that we've overshot our mark. If the initial goal was to make mental illness less taboo, less stigmatized, then we've missed our exit by a long shot. Years of having people come forward about their struggles with X diagnosis and be lauded for it, considered brave and given significant amounts of attention and sympathy, have left an impression on our culture. We often echo successful tactics we see in others, so if your friend starts claiming they suffer severe anxiety, and then they start receiving more attention and sympathy from others, then there's a real incentive for you to do the same. This is exacerbated by the spreading of vague disorder symptoms, which lead the more suggestible to believe the negative feelings we all experience as a part of everyday life are actually due to a mental illness. Astrology is a common use of this technique. It's vague enough to apply to every personality, and human suggestibility is very strong, as observed in first-year psych students who tend to self-diagnose themselves with the very illnesses they are studying. A good example would be feeling restless and struggling with procrastination. Those are problems we all face, but that alone certainly does not mean you have ADHD. The problem all this self-diagnosing creates is that it diminishes the real plight of those who actually have to live with these diagnoses. If everyone says they have anxiety when they feel stress, then there are no words left to express anxiety. If you were to try to explain that you were actually debilitated by anxiety, others would scoff, because they think you mean stress. We've seen this happen already with ADHD, OCD, depression, and bipolar. This side of the argument, I'll admit, is very convincing to me, because I feel it's the most empathetic. I don't want to rob people suffering with mental illness the severity of their condition. They should be taken seriously and not be trivialized. Interestingly enough, the flip side actually agrees with all that criticism. They're on the same page there. It's just that they don't really think it's such a big deal. The argument here is that the benefits outweigh the negatives. For every person who is claiming to have Tourette's for more likes, there's a struggling teenager with Tourette's who sees their post and either 1, feels comforted by seeing others like them, or 2, suddenly learns that their tics are due to an actual medical condition and can seek help, the latter being the main benefit. It's for this reason that some medical professionals don't even mind self-diagnosing. Seeking a diagnosis could be out of reach for some individuals, like those without health insurance in the US. Self-diagnosing is also defended due to the history of gender bias in mental health. For a long time, and still to this day, ADHD and autism are underdiagnosed in women, as historically they were believed to be predominantly male conditions. So despite all the disingenuous clout chasing that occurs, mental illness being trendy is helping some people, particularly teenage girls. And as my research continued, I would come to find out that it really is teenage girls that are at the heart of this matter. So there's your arguments. I hope you picked a side. I'll tell you now that I actually switched sides by the time I was done researching this, because it's a far more meaty subject than I was prepared for. My question going in was why? Why is mental illness becoming desirable? Why would someone want this? Well, to start answering that, we gotta go way back to the time of Hippocrates, around 400 BC. In an effort to explain the mysteries of the human body, Hippocrates proposed humorism. Humorism possibly existed for much longer, but he gave it a medical application. He claimed there were 4 humors of the body, and each equated to a bodily fluid, certain emotions, an organ, a season, a planet, and so on. In order to remain in perfect health, the 4 humors, the fluids of the body, needed to remain in equilibrium. If one were to rise, particular ailments associated with that fluid would be observed. So in Hippocrates' time, this allowed for them to diagnose illnesses. The humor we are interested in is the melancholic. Melancholic was associated with black bile in the planet Saturn. Those with an excess of black bile would present with a decreased appetite, pale skin, sleeplessness, and would be withdrawn. They'd be exhibiting melancholy, symptoms that today would be associated with major depression. However, it was this black bile that was also thought to give us our abilities to be introspective, contemplative, empathize with others, be sensitive to emotions, and be eccentric. Black bile was what artists had too much of. It was artists, creative and interesting, that suffered from melancholy. This is incredibly important. This is perhaps the birth of what would become a long history of romanticizing mental illness. A fascinating book entitled Illness as Metaphor by Susan Sontag tracked this romanticizing of illness and mental illness through literature. Long before 13 Reasons upset audiences by romanticizing suicide, audiences that seem to forget how Romeo and Juliet ended, there was actually a cultural love affair with tuberculosis. From the late 18th century to the early 19th century, tuberculosis became fashionable. It was seen as this mysterious disease that affected the young, the sexually pure and romantic. As it ravaged your body, it made you gaunt, pale, and delicate, like a porcelain doll. Suddenly, it became rude to eat heartily, and instead became glamorous to look sickly. Sontag suggests that our modern-day thin fashion, the prevalence of thinspiration and the such, actually formed here. As bizarre as it sounds, tuberculosis truly was romanticized, as evidenced by the journal writings Sontag included. I'll share 2. Chopin was tubercular at a time when good health was not chic. It was fashionable to be pale and drained. I cough continually, but for a wonder, far from making me look ugly, this gives me an air of languor that is very becoming. Those with tuberculosis presented as pale, thin, and with a dissatisfied demeanor, and this shared a striking similarity to the black bile melancholy. So they became equated. Tuberculosis was even used as a metaphor for feeling depressed in the 19th century. To suffer tuberculosis, to suffer melancholy, was chic. They were artists, prone to moodiness, sensitivity, and deeply interesting. We can look back now and say how ridiculous it all sounds, but the underlying mentality never left, which brings me to the sad girl. If you've never heard the term sad girl, the best way I can explain it is to just present a certain aesthetic. Pastels, cigarettes hanging limply, perfectly smudged mascara, ripped leggings, fishnets or jeans, bruises, gothic mirrors, apathetic or exasperated facial expressions, a toxic boyfriend, Sailor Moon, the virgin suicides. Odds are you know exactly the style I'm referring to, or even a person who adopts this aesthetic. Sad girls were exemplified by Lana Del Rey and social media accounts like So Sad Today, which still post tweets like, "Oh look, it's a hell of my own making." It's an aesthetic that presents a stylized melancholy, a self-deprecating glamour that's following in the footsteps of black bile and tuberculosis. But for a time in the mid-2010s, the sad girl meant more than a fashion statement. Audrey Woolen sought to dive deeper, and she proposed the sad girl theory. This stated that the sadness, the expressed suffering of young women, was an active form of protest. That in a patriarchal society forced upon women, actively expressing dissatisfaction with the life it provided them gave girls a way to reclaim agency over their lives. I am not going to weigh in on whether this is what young women adopting the sad girl style were doing. Some like Audrey Woolen we know certainly were, but it's what the sad girl style eventually became that's important. It became commercialized. The sad girl sold out. It became a persona for privileged white girls who wanted to embody the sad, young, and beautiful ideal. The sad girl never progressed past images of beautiful, thin white women, who could be mistaken for tuberculosis patients. It lacked the unflattering, repulsive, downright ugly side of sadness. Makeup after crying was only smudged in a flattering way. No runny nose, no bloodshot eyes, no weight gain from emotional eating, no ratty clothes from living in poverty, no crooked teeth from being too poor to afford braces. Like black bile and like tuberculosis, it was nothing more than romanticizing an illness to be fashionable. So what does this all have to tell us about what's happening on TikTok? Well, I'd say the connection is pretty clear. This has been going on for a long time, and this is just the most recent iteration. It's romanticizing illness to be fashionable. It looks different now in an era of inclusivity, but it'd be silly to think it's different. Just like tuberculosis and the sad girl, it trivializes what it's romanticizing. Even if it started as something admirable, a form of activism, it's progressed and will always progress into a marketable fashion. Do you want to be fashionable? Well, buy this shirt signaling you have ADHD. Buy a pin to show you have DID, or rake in our most precious currency, attention, by posting on TikTok. It's marketed, it's fashionable, and we will always see some sort of illness being romanticized in this way. But this is why I don't blame the younger generation for partaking in this or feel they need to stop. This behavior has been occurring for centuries, and we shouldn't be outraged, we should be understanding. When I was in high school, it was at the height of the emo phase, and that culture showered attention and sympathy on those who were cutting themselves. It glamorized self-harm. There's something alluring about an illness. We inherently feel it makes us more interesting, more like an artist. These teenagers just want to feel like they have too much black bile and it's caused an illness. And that's just how it's always been.